Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. We're continuing our review of this wonderful series of books. This is just one book in the series. It's called Muslim Women's Attire and Adornment by al-Halim Abu Shuqqah. And now we're going to be speaking about Niqab. Dr. Shabir, let's talk about that. So Abu Shuqqah says that the Niqab is not prescribed in the Quran as obligatory for Muslim women. So maybe Dr. Shabir, you can expand upon that and tell us about his argument a bit more.
Yeah, actually, he goes even further than that, Sophia. He says that the niqab is not even mentioned in the Quran, and he's right. There's the word niqab actually does not.
That's true. Yes,
it's not mentioned. And
there's khimar, jilbab, hijab.
Yeah.
But no niqab, right?
Yes, exactly. And of course, we've already seen in the previous segment that hijab has a different meaning in the Quran than actually the woman's head cover. Though, as you said, the khimar is mentioned, which is usually a woman's head cover. But as for the word niqab, this does not occur. And interestingly, al-Halim Abu Shuqqah also points out that in his search for the word niqab in the classical collections of Hadith, he could find only one reference in which the word niqab is used, only one hadith. And that's the hadith that says that when women are consecrated for the pilgrimage, whether the Hajj or the Umrah, they are in that state not to cover their faces.
So the hadith is saying don't wear the niqab.
At least at that time.
Yes.
Now, of course, those who hold to the traditional paradigm, they will say, so you see, the women were generally covering and were required to cover their faces at all times. And they were only told not to cover their faces while they were consecrated for hijab. They might even press the argument further and say that if women generally did not cover, then there would be no need to tell them don't cover, don't wear a niqab because if nobody's wearing that, what's the point of saying don't do it? But Abu Shuqqah has an answer for that. So one aspect of his answer is that the niqab, according to how he traces it, was a practice of some women prior to the revelation of the Quran. Prior to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, some women in societies wore the niqab as an item of luxury. Often, women who were of an upper class, they wore it as a sign of distinction and so on. But women in general did not wear it. So even after the Quranic revelation came, because there was no prohibition, there is no verse of the Quran that says, no, you cannot wear the niqab, or no hadith that says in general that you cannot wear the niqab. So because Muslim women were not prohibited from covering their faces in general, some women continued to wear the niqab. So this hadith that says don't wear the niqab when you are consecrated, when you're in the state of ihram for the Hajj or Umrah, this makes sense in that context because there were some women who might have continued to cover their faces.
Does he assume that the Prophet's wives wore the niqab?
Yes, and I will allow me to say one more thing about this, and then I'll get to that. So one other aspect of this is that al-Halim is explaining why women were told not to cover their faces during the consecrated state, because he's saying that the consecrated state requires us to be humble before God, and that humility is more deeply expressed when we leave off extraneous bits of clothing. So for a man, for example, a man would be relaxed at home, and when he's ready to greet his guests, he might put on his hat. So that's an extraneous piece of clothing that is not really required. It doesn't shield you from the heat and cold. It is just something that makes your outfit look more complete. Now, in the case of the woman, the niqab might have served the same sort of purpose. So whereas a man for the consecrated state would not be allowed to cover his head, so too the woman for the consecrated state would not be allowed to cover her face. So
I've never heard anyone say something like this before. Have you?
It's an interesting insight.
Okay.
He's giving the rationale for why the women were being told to not cover their faces while they are performing the Hajj during that consecrated period of consecration. So now, coming back to your question about the wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him. You know how in a previous episode we have, or segment, we talked about how the word hijab was used as a curtain,
Yes.
to refer to the curtain that was drawn between the Prophet's living quarters and the guest quarters. So the believers in general were told to not ask the wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him, for anything except from behind such a curtain. Now, that would obviously apply when men came to the home of the Prophet, peace be upon him. What if they would accost one of the wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him, on the street? So there would be no separation between them and the wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So what would be the nearest thing to a separation, to a curtain? It wouldn't be a curtain that they could carry around with them, but the covering the face for them was a way of keeping some distance between them and the men. So the wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him, according to al-Halim Abu Shuqqah, generally wore a niqab or a face covering when they went abroad, when they went out of doors. This is another actually very deep insight, because this would explain a host of hadiths. So when people want to cite hadiths to show that women generally wore a niqab or a face covering in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, they would cite hadiths which mention a certain wife of the Prophet, peace be upon him, being covered with a niqab.
Which is the wife?
Either it is Aisha radiallahu anha or another wife of the
Okay.
Prophet, peace be upon him. So Abdul Halim is saying that, generally the wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him, wore a niqab, but only they generally wore it. Other women may have worn it for other reasons, like, for example, people wore it as a luxury item, as a sign of being an upper class person, and so on. But it was not generally among Muslim women that the niqab was worn. Only generally among the wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him, was the niqab a common practice.
Mm-hmm.
And so we find, yes, a number of hadiths which indicate that a certain wife of the Prophet, peace be upon him, on this occasion, or a certain other wife on another occasion, was seen to be covered with a niqab. But he says we cannot generalize this to all women. They were required to have the hijab, which was a curtain, when they were in their homes. And when they were out of their homes, the closest thing to that was for them to have the niqab. And though this was not specifically mentioned, it seemed within the spirit of that hijab, of that curtain, that they would have a mini sort of curtain, at least shielding their faces from the gaze of the men to whom they were not directly related.
Mm-hmm. So what is the lesson that Abu Shuqqah draws from this, and Dr. Shabir?
Well, what he draws from this is that women in general in an Islamic society are not required to cover their faces.
Mm-hmm.
And for them
Doesn't
to
he
be
draw on
required-
some hadith as well to point out that some Muslim women are, not covering their faces at the time of the Prophet Muhammad?
Yes, in fact, he mentioned several hadiths, that indicate that women were generally recognized. Like a hadith would say, for example, this woman came to speak to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and her cheeks were reddish black. So that means, one can say maybe she had a partial covering on her face and so on, one cheek covered, whatever they might say. But the hadiths do not go to any lengths to explain why people were able to recognize the women. If women generally covered their faces, you would expect that the hadiths would give some explanation for
like her niqab slipped or something
like this, yes.
Right?
And we find such things with regards to the wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Like, for example, there is a hadith saying that Aisha radiallahu anha was left alone in an abandoned camp, and she fell asleep there. And then she was discovered by one of the Muslim men, and he recognized her.
Mm-hmm.
So Aisha radiallahu anha said, he recognized me because he used to see me before the verse of the hijab was revealed.
Mm-hmm.
So that means since the verse of the hijab was revealed, from that time onwards, men could not see her face, because either they asked her from behind a curtain, or when she went out of her home, she wore a niqab. So now she's explaining why the man recognized her, because he used to see her before the hijab was a practice. Similarly, with Sauda, another wife of the Prophet, peace be upon him, Umar radiallahu anhu once called out to her and said, Sauda, we recognize you. And the hadith explains that's because she was tall and bulky. So in that smaller population, she was easily, distinguished from the rest of the crowd. So the hadith is explaining how they were recognized even though they were covering their faces. Now, with women in general, you would need some explanation for why they were recognized on a certain occasion. Now, you find the opposite is true. Like there's a hadith explaining why they were not recognized. It's an interesting one. The hadith says that women used to go out during the time of the Prophet's lifetime for the morning prayer, that is the Fajr prayer, in the early dawn while it was still dark. And even while they returned from the prayer, nobody recognized them due to the darkness. Now, notice the expression here that nobody recognized them due to the darkness. Now, if they were covering their faces, there was no need to say that the darkness obscured rendered them momentarily incognito. What would have made them incognito would have been the face veil. But here, it is the darkness that made them difficult to recognize. So this and many other narratives show that in general, women did not cover their faces in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. You might find an exception, but no, generally not. Now, the hadith that says that the women are not to cover their faces when they're in the state of consecration shows that there was nothing really harmful in a man seeing a woman, so long as he was not staring at her, unduly. And that hadith itself, there is a related narrative that shows that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was together with his cousin, Fadl, the son of Abbas, and a woman came to ask the Prophet, peace be upon him, a question. And the hadith even describes her as beautiful, which means that men observed her and, they had a sense of what she looked like, and nobody objected to this. But Fadl, being a young man, he was like staring at her. And the hadith even justifies that as being due to her exceptional beauty. But the Prophet, peace be upon him, saw what was happening, and he touched the head of his cousin and helped him to turn his head, right? So what was objectionable there, according to Abu Shuqqah, is staring rudely at the person. But, a momentary glance, ordinary vision, this is not condemned. And in fact, the Prophet, peace be upon him, was speaking to her in an ordinary way. His companions were, other than Fadl, who was so enamored by her beauty, were just having a normal interaction with her. This was not condemned. So, in short, women generally did not cover their faces in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And in fact, I would add that if they generally did, it would have been what we would call a fitna for women to go to the Hajj with their faces uncovered, because here they're going to be seen by men who never saw them before. This is going to be the largest possible gathering of Muslims, with men coming from all of the outskirt regions. And they would see women that they never saw before. And, how would they focus on their Hajj if they were not accustomed to seeing the faces of women? So it must be that they were accustomed to seeing the faces of women, and, seeing them in Hajj with their faces uncovered would not have been an issue at all.
Wow. Fascinating insights from Abu Shuqqah.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Akshay.
You're welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Muslim Media Hub, the new home of Let the Quran Speak.
Here we spread positivity and good. We help people experience the beauty of Islam and help them appreciate and understand Muslims.
This beautiful building we purchased at cost $2.3 million.
Yeah, we've already raised a third of that money, and with your help, inshallah, we can pay off the rest.
So we're looking for people who can give $1,000 each. If you can be part of the select group, that's amazing.
Otherwise, just please give whatever you can. Every dollar counts.
It's our collective responsibility to share the message of Islam with our fellow human beings. Please help us continue this good work.
It's a sadaqah jariyah, something that will continue to be a benefit to the Muslim community long after Safiya and I are gone.
Please support our work at muslimmediahub.com.
Your support is zakat eligible and tax deductible.
May Allah bless you and your loved ones today and always. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.